what we're going to do is just introduce ourselves very briefly, and then I'll sort of set some context around the presentation, explain what we're going to be talking about respectively. So Marcel, can I just hand over to you just to explain who you are and what you're doing here?
Yes, perfect. Thanks very much. So hello, everyone out there listening and watching. Thanks for joining. My name is Marcel. I'm working for PwC Germany here in Frankfurt, currently working from home. I'm head of our open source software services, and which include from strategies to execution, everything you need around open source software usage, management, and compliance. And as the global auditing and consulting firm, PwC, our purpose is to build trust in society and solve important problems. And exactly this is what we are talking about today regarding open source software and open source compliance, building trust in open source management and in its supply chains. As PwC, we help getting open source compliance right. We also provide audit and certification, which is our topic today. And therefore, I'm thrilled to have this talk here today. Thanks for your interest.
Fantastic, thanks Marcel. I'm Andrew Katz, so I'm a lawyer. I've been advising on free and open source issues for over 20 years now, and through my law firm Moorcrofts, we advise on a wide range of free and open source software issues. So in many ways, I have been advising clients on conformance for free and open source before even the days of OpenChain came into view. So more recently, we formed a sister company, Orcro, because we decided that conformance and compliance are something that are really much more process driven. So as a result, we decided to really separate the activities that we undertake through Moorcrofts, which is very much more in terms of the legal advice, analysing the terms of the contracts and the licenses and so on and so forth, and the work that we do through Orcro, which is very much more on the compliance side. So Orcro is an OpenChain partner, as is Moorcrofts, and through Orcro we can provide a wide range of compliance services, and they include consultancy on various aspects of open source compliance, getting people ready for OpenChain conformance, and also providing OpenChain conformance assessments. So the next really stage of this journey is to move into the certification side of things, and that's obviously what we're going to be talking about now. So in terms of putting this into context, I'm not going to go into this in too great a depth because everyone that's listening today has a good understanding of the importance and the role of open source and its complete pervasiveness throughout every part of industry, commerce, academia, and the public sector as well. But fundamentally, I think Marcel really said the most important thing is that this is really to do with trust, and trust is an aspect of assessment and understanding of risk. And despite the well understood and very broad benefits of open source, there are clearly a number of risks that come with that as well. So the approach to take really is to look at this not just individually in terms of the use of open source, but take a more holistic view as well, and look at the different aspects of the way that that risk can manifest itself. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the context of a particular case study that we've got later in the financial services sector. So what we're going to be talking about through this presentation is really why should we be certifying, what is involved in certification, what is it, and also how we go about the certification process. So why would you want to perform a third-party certification of your open source software processes and procedures? And what it's about really, it's about completing the package. To get to the stage where you're thinking about certification, you'll have already been through a lot of the activities that have been talked about in the other presentations today. And the reality is that really is the bulk of the work has been done elsewhere. So you will typically start out by analyzing the composition of the software, looking at the various processes and procedures that are developed around that, look at how that fits into the context of your organization, and so on. And that is really the heavy lifting. That really is the most complex part of the whole process. process. So the amount of effort that is required to get to the final stage of certification is relatively small. It basically leverages the extensive work that you'll have done already. And what we're doing here is we are building on and trying to generate this idea of trust that can be passed on to others within the supply chain. So why would you want to perform third-party certification? So it's really looking at it from two different aspects. And again, we've got some case studies later on where we can look at the practical reasons as to why people are looking into this as a particular solution for them. But starting out with the benefits that exist for the suppliers, I mean, clearly, it is a way of demonstrating compliance with the OpenChain, the ISO, as far as your customers and your potential customers are concerned, and it's very straightforward. From a marketing and presentational perspective, it's much more straightforward to be able to say, yeah, we're OpenChain compliant, we're compliant with this new ISO, and here is our conformance certificate, and it's been provided by an independent third-party organization. So that's a story that's very, very easy to tell. It's very straightforward. But ultimately, what it does is it provides a seal of quality, which is based on the efforts that you've put in so far throughout the whole of the conformance process. The process of getting towards this obviously is going to be something that will provide benefit to the organization in terms of understanding how it will fit in with your existing processes and procedures as well. One of the key reasons why you might want to look to certification is a certificate will enable you to take part in or give you an advantage in terms of applying for bids in tenders that you may not otherwise be able to do. And there's already a number of organizations who've publicly stated that they are going to prefer suppliers of software who are OpenChain conformant. And at this stage, it may be that they're self-certified as OpenChain conformant, or it may be they've got an independence assessment, or it may be that they're certificated. But certainly, there are plenty of organizations who've made a public statement that they're going to prefer OpenChain conformant organizations. And some of them have also stated that this is going to move on to a situation where they're going to actually require OpenChain conformance, again, whether that's self-certification or whether it's independent assessment or whether it's certification. I mean, one of the organizations that has publicly mentioned that is Scania. So this is part of their roadmap as well. There's several other organizations, some of whom are OpenChain members, who have specifically stated that that's what they intend to do. So it becomes so much easier to tell the story, not only to those customers who are actually requiring certification, that you have a certificate. I mean, that is something that goes without saying. But it also means that as an industry groundswell develops and customers become aware of the existence of the certification, it just makes it so much easier for them to tick the box and say, yes, that particular concern is covered. So I think that's a sort of pretty key reason as to why people might want certification. We have also had situations, this is on the Moorcroft's legal side, already, where we have found that contract negotiations have gone significantly more smoothly because our client is OpenChain conformant. In this case, it's a self-certification that they've achieved. But as part of a contract negotiation, they are supplying software to an organization which is aware of OpenChain, and they had asked a bunch of fairly complicated warranties in the contract documentation, and we were simply able to assure them that the client was self-certified for OpenChain conformance. So it's a natural that made the negotiation so much more straightforward. They immediately said, we don't need all these additional warranties. The warranty of conformance is sufficient. And you can see how that will naturally lead to making that process that much more straightforward if it becomes a third-party certification that is required as well. So that's another significant reason that we are finding that we're getting a number of inquiries as to why people want to do that. It's something that really embeds compliance and the awareness of necessity of audit processes within an organization. And there's a number of other areas where audit is becoming and compliance is becoming significantly more important. And we're not just talking about regulated sectors, but we're talking about things like GDPR, for example, where the intention is that the legislation drives organizations to develop a compliance culture. So that compliance culture is naturally a comfortable home for something like OpenChain certification. And the idea that as companies become more comfortable with dealing with external auditors and certifications for things like GDPR compliance, but also in the regulated sector, then you've got sort of visits from regulators and you've got various other certification schemes as well. That all feeds into the whole ecosystem, the cultural of compliance. So if you look at it from the other side of the piece, for companies who are engaging with their suppliers, then it basically makes it so much easier to purchase from a supplier who's OpenChain compliant. We've touched on this already, but it means that initially there's going to be an assumption that any form of due diligence which is being carried out on the supplier, if they're OpenChain compliant, that means that there is an awareness of the information that's going to be made available for them to fulfill the due diligence process, or even in certain circumstances, it might be decided by the customer that they don't need to do any due diligence at all, because the very fact of a third-party OpenChain certification is sufficient to short-circuit all of that. Of course, we're talking about supply chain here, so it may well be the case that the supplier supplies a customer who then themselves becomes a supplier down the chain. So as the whole scheme of OpenChain compliance becomes more pervasive within the industry, it just reduces friction everywhere, and it becomes much more straightforward for any organization that's sitting within that supply chain, not only to purchase from people who are OpenChain compliant, but also to sell to people because they themselves are OpenChain compliant. So it's a question of building the ecosystem, and certification in that context again reduces the friction and the complication involved. There's also a possibility that it may also lead to the development of additional products which are outside the scope of just purely the provision of the software itself. I, many years ago, worked with an insurance company who was prepared to supply insurance products based on the fact that suppliers had self-certified themselves as having followed a number of procedures, which not entirely uncoincidentally were very similar to the procedures that now exist as the criteria for the OpenChain specification. And it may be that certification is also something that will enable access to market for third-party products such as insurance down the line. But that's essentially something that we can talk about later. But it also means, and we'll also talk about this a little bit later as well, that if we have a consistent set of audit standards, then it makes it, again, reduces the friction for suppliers even further, because then they will be able to look, for customers even further, because they will be able to look at a roster of suppliers who have certification, know that those certifications have been carried out to a set of consistent standards, and therefore it makes it much easier for them to compare like with like if they're looking at making a decision as to who their supplier for a particular product is going to be. So it provides continuity and consistency there as well. Ultimately, obviously, they have the ability to rely on the fact that because these certifications are carried out to a pre-existing standard, that they're done on an unbiased basis, and they're done independently as well. So one of the important things that we need to ensure is that the certifications are carried out in a way that assures that independence and the fact that the assessment is unbiased. And when we go through the process a little bit later, we can explain that in slightly greater depth. So Marcel, can I hand over to you now?
Yes, Andrew, thanks. So I think it was quite clear why and where a third-party certification makes sense, where it is beneficial or even required for a company. So now let's talk about some aspects around third-party certification. So trustworthiness is one of the major points here we want to talk about, because the trustworthiness of the third party directly reflects to the trust and confidence the certificate provides to the company who wants to get certified. So, and accreditation, for example, is one important topic here, that third-party certifiers should or sometimes are requested to or have to be accredited by a governmental authority or a company that is entrusted by the state. So, for example, here in Germany, it's the DAX, and they do an accreditation for certifiers to ensure the high quality and trust that a certification provides. So, and this is also very important to keep the quality standard of a certification and the trust of a certification. This is ensured by an external accreditation certifiers have to go through. Another important topic is independence. Of course, an auditor and a certifier needs to be independent and not conflicted with the company and with the personnel in charge. So objectivity is key. Quality assurance is also a very important measurement that is in place and has to be in place for third-party certifiers to keep up the standard and the quality, and the professionalism of the certifier. So in normal cases, an internal quality management is installed within the certifier. They do internal reviews, they have a continuous improvement process, and thereby it's ensured that the certificate for several entities, companies, and if it's done more regularly over the years, but that the certificate in the end always applies to the same standard, to the same high quality measures, and therefore provides the same level of trust throughout different certificates. And another point I want to cover here is that's a complicated word in English. It's a reproducibility. So actually what we mean with this word is that a certifier does comes up with an internal documentation, of course, of the whole certification process, and documents which audit measures have been performed and which decisions have been taken, and therefore also for another certifier or for another third party or whatever, it would be comprehensible and traceable what has been done, and if the result is correct. And this again is relevant for the high quality and trust which a certification does provide. Then let's look into some audit techniques. So some of you, many of you, however, might have been through audits, through financial audits, through process audits, through security audits, whatsoever. And the audit approaches we use here for the ISO certification are very similar. So of course, one audit technique might or is the inquiry. So that's where we have a discussion with the company to be certified on the different topics. We perform interviews. We get an understanding if all the measurements and requirements from the standard are applied. So that's basically inquiry. The next audit technique and approach is inspection. So this is particularly used for policies and documents and process descriptions, etc. So also for evidences that we ask throughout a certification. So these documents are inspected, they are looked through, the content is reviewed, and this is one of the other main audit approaches. And then to cover this off, there's observation and reperformance. So that's the most in-depth audit technique. where actually a process or, for example, a creation of a bill of material or something is repeated, is regenerated, it's a walkthrough, and actually the certifier does this observation to ensure that the process and is performed correctly. And let's quickly talk about sampling. So when we do an audit, of course, sampling is important. Wherever processes are performed several times, etc., a sample can be drawn and can be selected to do a reperformance of these audit objects. And the sample size is dependent on the population of the population size and the criticality. And in particular cases, a targeted testing could be performed as well, where applicable. And since we've now covered off these audit techniques, let's look into a particular example here from the ISO standard from OpenChain. Let me read out these things loudly. So we are here in section 3.3, open source content review and approval, for example, and 3.3.1 is bill of materials. And there the OpenChain ISO verification material 3311 is a documented procedure for identifying, tracking, reviewing, approving, and archiving information about the collection of open source components from which the supplied software is comprised. And now the possible and exemplary audit contents and focus areas here, for example, would be to discuss, inspect, and run through, for example, the tool chain and processes around generating these information for bill of material. How is dependency resolution taken care of? What does the packet manager do? Which clarifications on missing information are performed? Is any code scanning applied, and to which extent? And what is done with the results of the code scanning? And how is this whole process of bill of material creation integrated into the CI/CD toolchain? And which qualities gates are taken. So this just as a very practical example. Or here, the next one is, I'll read it out loud again. It's 3312. That's a verification material which needs to be provided and tested. It's open source component records for the supplied software that demonstrates the documented procedure was properly followed. So here we would look into a bill of material, including the additional information and documentation like the licenses, copyright owners, and version numbers of used open source components. We would inspect the documentation on demonstrating how these components were identified and approved, and any further information on the clearing process, if any was applied. Here just the last one, to give you some examples. 3.3.2 is license compliance. That's another section of the standard here. And the verification material that needs to be audited is 3321, a documented procedure for handling the common open source license use cases for the open source components of the supplied software. So here it's relevant to look into the measures and to identify the triggers like distribution, modification, and integration into other software, so that based on these triggers, the use case can be defined. Is it a distribution? Is it not distributed in software as a service? And based on this, the obligations need to be identified, which are relevant for this use case. And something like license shards or approved deny lists might then help to identify what needs to be done for the particular use case. And clearing and approval processes should be around it. And so in the end, we have a clear documentation for these particular use cases and how they are defined. So how is this supported? Here you see some screenshots of applications, of tools which help to perform such audits. So, for example, you have here a dashboard with the status and overview. You can up and download documents through a secure way, because lots of documents need to be shared and inspected throughout an audit. And actually this tooling helps to cluster the different sections and to ask for all the different materials. Then a communication can follow through this tooling as well. And particularly when it comes to performing several audits, for example, for a large company that wants to audit and certify several of their critical suppliers, it's quite handy to have an overview. Which suppliers have already been certified? What is the progress? Are there any non-compliances already identified? And then you can also drill down into, for example, in section 3 and see the status for all your suppliers, etc. And the audit process is basically 5 steps. So first of all, it's about understanding the scope. So now this is from the perspective of an auditor and certifier. The scope needs to be understood, because then the audit measurements and need to be aligned and defined to the scope. Then all the documents need to be acquired and received. And here it's about policies and guidelines and the procedure, process documentations, and all this good stuff that is in place. In the next step, it's about the design effectiveness. So this is a audit term. We talk about design effectiveness and operating effectiveness. And design effectiveness is to look into the design of processes and documents, etc., and see if they are fit for purpose, if they are set up correctly, and if the process as it is defined is capable for solving the problem and the issue. And there we check that there are no logical loopholes or any missing parts, and that the content actually makes sense. This is particularly done with the audit techniques of inquiry and review. And then the next part, it's about the operating effectiveness. So the one thing is to say, okay, this is designed correctly, this is good, and this will solve the problem, this will bring compliance to your open source usage. And the next thing is then to check that these well-designed processes and procedures are actually then also applied and operative. And this is then done through sample test of observation and reperformance. This is, if possible, done on-site, but can also be done offline through screen sharing, etc. And this gives a really good and very good feeling and good evidence that everything is working as it should be, and this gives a high audit comfort. And all of this then ends in a certificate, which is basically one sheet of paper which says that, in best case, that the certificate can be provided to this company, but also it's followed with a report which gives you, if any, hints on findings and additional information. So now, of course, we see companies and talk to companies which say, yeah, nice process, but in the end, I fear that when we run through it the first time, we might not directly get the certificate and might have some issues here and there. So what can we do? And of course, this is also taken care of as well, and it's called readiness assessment. It might have different other names as well, of course. But basically, a readiness assessment is something that you can do before you do the official certification, because within the certification process, when you have a finding, it will be reported, and there's no doubt about it. That's an official certification. But within a readiness assessment, that's as the name says, it helps to make you ready. So not the full depth audit is run through. It's more about spot checks of the processes and guidelines. We can also then set some focus areas and say, okay, here in this area, it might be especially tricky. Let's look into this area a bit deeper. And then walkthroughs and test of one would be performed. So again, we wouldn't take a full sample of an sample size, but only a test of one and check for one particular element if it's working correctly. And then a report or draft recommendations come out with the findings and a recommendation plan how this can be fixed. And after this then has been performed by the company, they are ready for certification. So then back to you, Andrew, for some case studies.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thanks very much, Marcel. So what was we found quite interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, we've been providing essentially audits for many, many years, even prior to OpenChain. And the first one of these was a financial services business that we first came across around, I guess, 10 years or so ago. And they had a specific issue in that they're not a financial services company themselves. They're a software services company, and they were providing a particular software application on a SaaS basis. All of their clients were financial services companies like pension funds, etc. And what they did was to provide portfolio valuation services for things like pension funds, etc. So the services that they were providing were business critical to their customers. Their customers were all in the regulated sector, and as part of analysing their systemic risk and their business and operational risk, these customers were insisting on any third-party providers that they were using that were business critical, which included my client. They had appropriately assessed the risk, so they were increasingly asking my client to be able to demonstrate that its continued operation was going to be effective, and that it wasn't going to be interrupted by a number of factors. And one of the factors that they were looking at was intellectual property risk. So one of the concerns was that my client's business might be shut down because it was infringing a software license, for example. And that therefore this would impact their own clients. And this is something that has recently become much clearer as a result of the MiFID regulations, which require organizations in the regulated sector to look at all aspects of operational risk. So this is something that's really now sort of baked into the regulation. But it was something that my client was doing, as I say, sort of 8 to 10 years ago. And they had asked us to provide independent certification that their software development methodologies were appropriate. They used a lot of open source code, so that their mechanisms were sufficient to ensure that the licenses were identified, that the people who were operating, who were developing the code, were aware of the rules, that the rules were being followed, that there were ways of dealing with exceptions, and so on and so forth. So what was very interesting is that we developed really from scratch at that stage, because there was no framework available, a system for them against which we could provide an audit, and this is something that they would then be able to provide to their clients and say, yes, this independent firm of lawyers, because we did it through the law firm at that stage, we're going to come in and crawl all over our systems and assess them against these particular audit standards, and the clients were happy with that, and then we would come in every year in order to provide the independent assessment. And many of the aspect that Marcel has been talking about were things that we independently developed, not particularly surprising because they're based on fairly standard audit concepts. So the idea, for example, of doing sampling of particular build processes, of sampling particular outputs to and analyses of licenses to make sure that they were consistent, and also sanity checking the systems overall. So what we actually put together for them, several years before OpenChain even came into existence, was essentially an OpenChain compliance program. And to be honest, the only things that compliance program didn't have that an OpenChain compliance program needs to have is the aspects that relate to engagement with third-party external open source projects, and also the requirement to have a specific named contact point for dealing with external open source queries. But other than that, the process that we put together was pretty similar. So this is really where sort of our experience of OpenChain compliance developed even before OpenChain became a thing, and the fact that this is now being now baked into MiFID, the requirement to check that there isn't operational risk, is something that I think is going to sort of drive this whole process forward fairly significantly. So another one which is much more current, and we're doing much more recently. This is an organisation which is specifically interested in being certified against the ISO, and we're hoping to be able to release certification as soon as the ISO is published, pretty much simultaneously with it. So this is an organisation which is a software company and which provides business process software into any number of other organizations. And really the driver behind that process was that first of all, they felt that they had a compliance problem internally, and they really wanted to put some sort of structure around it. They were used to putting structures in place for things like GDPR and felt that they needed to have some sort of structured approach. But they also wanted to go one stage further, and mainly from a marketing perspective, but also from an ease of negotiating contracts perspective, to be able to say that they have an independent certification. So this is something that they can talk about with their customers, and something that, if necessary, can be built into their contractual documentation as well. And then this led to an interesting conversation that we had with a small venture capital company. And this arises out of an activity that took place just over a year ago, when a SaaS software supplier was sold to a large media company. We weren't involved in the transaction to begin with, but at the last moment we were called in because their main asset was clearly some software, and they needed somebody to come in and assist with the due diligence process. So we came and helped them with due diligence, and in that case, they already had Black Duck tooling installed, so we helped to provide information based on the Black Duck tooling, and produced a remediation plan and so on and so forth, and the sale went through successfully. But after that sale, the venture capital company who was exiting at that point had said, it's a pity that that the sale had to be complicated by the fact that this due diligence exercise was strung out. How can we simplify that in future? We're pleased with the job that you did to sort it out at such short order, but how can we get ahead of the curve so that when we're exiting some of our other portfolio companies, that they already are in a position where it's possible for them to go through the due diligence process without all of this need for remediation at that stage. So I introduced them to OpenChain. They were instantly very interested in the idea, and they were particularly interested in the idea of certification. So now we've been introduced to their portfolio companies. They've got about 5 companies in their portfolio at the moment, which they're looking to exit between 1 and 3 years, and they're very keen to proceed to certification because they feel that that is something that, first of all, will enhance the value of the company and make it easier for the company to sell its products to its customers. But that's obviously a benefit to the VC, but also they're very keen to see it as something that will help with the sale process, because essentially it'll mean that a lot of the due diligence has been, has pre-occurred, has already taken place, and that the information that's required by the purchaser can just be handed over in a readily understandable, readily packaged format. So those are sort of 3 very different case studies that we've been involved with that indicate the value not only of OpenChain in general, but also certification more specifically. So Marcel, I think you wanted to talk about some of your experiences as well.
Yeah, actually, I want to add on one other different case study, because the one you've mentioned there very valuable and very interesting, and we've been involved in some similar stuff. But one more I wanted to mention here is, for example, large OEMs. So in this case, it's an industrial production company, and they are working with lots of suppliers, software suppliers, spare parts suppliers, etc., which they build into the end product, and the end product is distributed onto the market. The end product is actually not a software product; it's an industrial product, but it has a lot of software and software functionality in it. And so, since they're distributing it to the market, it's of course of high risk that open source compliance might gives them problems with their product if this is identified. And so in this case, the company has around 50 suppliers which are identified as critical for this end product. And they came up with the question, okay, how do we manage open source software and open source compliance of all these external parties? And of course, what they're currently doing is they are checking relevant and critical software supplies by their own, but now the case that they're looking into is to get a official third-party certification for all these suppliers with this new ISO, and therefore they can build trust into their suppliers, and they don't need to do these internal checks anymore, or not so frequently anymore. And they have a good understanding if their suppliers are compliant or not, and this helps them a lot in terms of internal budget, time to market, and that's a very important program and step for them to get all their suppliers certified. So that's quite an interesting point as well, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Good.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we're very, very happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
And you have a ton of questions.
Excellent, excellent. Right, I shall
with
unshare.
Mary
So
asking about Scania. Is Scania going to require third-party certification, or do you think self-certification would be adequate?
You would have to ask them about that. I mean, when they made the statement, when I talked to them about it, and I did ask them specifically whether they were happy for that to be made public, and I was told, yeah, that's fine, no problem. But at that point, we were simply talking about OpenChain conformance. So my understanding at the moment is that their position is probably that self-certification would be sufficient. But that is something that may change later. We shall have to see.
There's another one from Ricardo. I don't know if you can see it in the chat. He's bringing in the context of open source projects. What do you mean by third party? Is it the project? Just my little note there, Ricardo. I think OpenChain is primarily for companies rather than projects. So the third parties are various legal entities. But throwing it over to Andrew and Marcel, what do you think of Ricardo's question? How would you address that?
I'm happy to take this one because one of the things that we're working on at the moment, we're actually working with a project currently, and so this is a project within a public sector body, and as such, it is sort of slightly different. Also, to do with the fact that a lot of the development work that is being undertaken by that particular project is actually being undertaken by a third-party organization, which is a commercial open source development organization. So we've put quite a lot of effort into creating an open source policy. So I don't know if you're familiar with the template open source OpenChain compliant open source policy that we initiated, and it's available on the OpenChain project website. But we've actually expanded that so that rather than just covering organizations as it does at the moment, so there's a sort of generic column which basically creates a policy for generic organizations. We've also created another one specifically for open source projects, which deals specifically with how their governance structures tend to differ from the governance structures that you have inside a commercial organization. And we've also developed another one for micro businesses. So if you've got a very small organization that consists of sort of maybe up to 10 people, then obviously a lot of the roles that are involved will be overlapping, and it may be that the projects that they're working on are themselves smaller, and therefore the way that they can track they need to track the information that's contained in the individual components that they're using can be more straightforward. So what we're going to be submitting an update to that policy spreadsheet fairly shortly, which will address both the issue of projects and also micro businesses as well.
Got a couple more from Mary and Ricardo. Just hand over to you for those.
Right, Marcel, do you want to take any of these?
Let me see.
So this is Ricardo here. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I think let me paraphrase. Let me paraphrase my question. I guess it was a great presentation, great talk. So thank you. But when it comes to the use cases, because I'm very new to OpenChain, I've heard about it for a long time. So this is probably my first real sort of consolidated amount of time learning from you guys, you experts, about this. I think in the use cases specifically, I've seen. The only area I've really seen this potentially solve a real problem is when you've got M&A and sort of exit strategies bit playing out, and you need that better understanding and robustness around what that company has produced from an IP perspective. But the other ones felt a bit, I don't know, a bit wishy-washy for me. So I'm kind of like, I'm interested in finding out, especially in the financial services example you gave, right? I mean, I work with customers day in, day out. They standardize and use open source extensively. And this issue around MiFID and other things hasn't come up ever. So I'm trying to understand, what problem are you actually trying to solve in those sectors?
I mean, this thing has been raised a number of times at sort of FinOS conferences. So this is the organization, the foundation for open source in the financial sector, and certainly it's something that probably needs more understanding generally. I mean, as open source becomes more and more prevalent within the financial sector, people are starting to become more aware of it. Of course, the irony is that there is risk prevalent in any software, irrespective of whether that software is open source or not. And in fact, there are many arguments to say that the risks in using open source software are less than the risks in using much proprietary software. So the important thing to realize is that we're not talking about risks that are necessarily increased just because you happen to be using open source software. But certainly it does seem to be an issue that's being raised at some of the conferences that I have been to. And I think ultimately, it's going to be a question of whether the regulators start to say, is this something that you should be checking? And I thought it was very, very sort of interesting that this particular company that I was working for sort of 8 to 10 years ago was getting inquiries from their clients. They were asking them specifically to manage that particular risk. I guess it's one of those things that as it starts to become an industry norm, and as the industry starts to understand it more, then it'll become more significant and more prevalent.
Yeah, and also I just want to add, so I wouldn't make a big difference between financial services and other industries, because financial services, just like other industries, they use a lot of software, they produce a lot of software, and they distribute a lot of software. Just thinking about all the services they deliver through applications, through tools, through apps on mobile devices, through the internet, etc. And in all this software and services, they also use and build in open source software. And so therefore, open source software compliance is just as relevant for them like for any other company. So I wouldn't make there a big difference, to be honest.
Okay, anything else?
Shane, I think that's it so far.
Well, we do have a question from Mary, and that's an interesting one. In the context of OpenChain, is it an external body that certifies the certifiers? And that's an interesting question, because the answer is probably different in Germany and the UK. So who certifies the certifiers?
Mm-hmm. Marcel, do you want to start with that one?
So here in Germany, it's the DEX. It's called DEX, and that's an organization which is entrusted by the state to be able to do an accreditation for certifiers. So, and they work as per particular standards, and certification bodies like PwC Cert can be accredited, and actually on a certificate that the accredited certification body provides, you can also see a little stamp, a little information about being accredited, and therefore this certificate is much more trustworthy than a certificate where no accreditation has taken place. So short answer here in Germany, it's an external body called DAX, entrusted by the state, who does the accreditation of certification bodies.
Mm-hmm. So in the UK, the situation is that sort of UCAS is very much the equivalent body, and the way that UCAS operates is that essentially it's got to decide that it's going to take a particular standard under its wing, and therefore it will become the accreditation body for that particular standard. So at the moment it's sort of premature for it to say that it's going to take on OpenChain. From our perspective, I would very much welcome a third-party certifier. I mean, the way that we basically govern our own procedures at the moment is that they're modelled very closely on external principles that come from the world of financial audit, and we have somebody, Trevor Dyer, who's very experienced in procedural quality assurance audits, such as Lexcel. And investors in people that are respected standards in the UK. So he's helped us to design the audit program, and we're continuing to refine that. But I think ultimately we do need to get to a situation where an organisation such as UCAS actually provides an official accreditation, and that's something that we'd be very sort of strongly behind.
We've got another interesting question from Jared, which is about M&A. And I think this is a good one because it's one of those loaded questions. So in the future with M&A, do you think if a target company shows OpenChain conformance, that's enough for the buyer to be happy without a code scan or audit? Or would it be more of that OpenChain certification is a big plus when doing due diligence?
I think there's not an easy yes or no answer to this question, because in the end it's the question, what is the main asset of the deal? So if the main asset of the deal is a tech company, and the main asset is software and the IP of the software, etc., and this is, as I say, the main asset, a certification might not be enough. And there, a code scanning exercise and audit, etc., probably needs to be performed still. But I guess the certification will help a lot for other deals where software and the IP and etc. is relevant, but not the main asset. So in the end, it's up to discussions with the buying company and the target company. What is the best approach for the particular situation?
Yeah, I mean, clients often have a perception, whether it's true or not, that lawyers will gold plate the due diligence process, and due diligence is very frequently the most expensive part of any transaction as well. So it really provides an alternative for the client to determine, in the context of whole of their appetite for risk. So it's sort of, it gives them a better understanding of the whole cost benefit analysis of either proceeding just purely on the basis of certification, or whether it's something that requires further investigation. As Marcel says, it's very much going to sort of vary on a transaction by transaction basis, but at least it enables the conversation to be opened with the client. Because the answer to the question is how much do you want to spend on due diligence is, basically infinite amounts of money, and quite a lot of lawyers have a reputation for pushing their clients in the direction of doing absolutely everything they can, but ultimately, like everything else in business, it has to be a question of costs and benefits.
One thing that I've observed in practice in the market, and I don't know if you'd want to comment on it, but I've noticed that OpenChain is appearing in M&A, not just in the context of, let's say, making sure the intellectual property management is effective, but also in identifying when a company doesn't have great processes in place, both for protection, but also to drive down purchase pricing, which is just an interesting side of it.
Yeah, that's certainly happening.
Sorry to be. I have a further question, not related to M&A. Do you think the OpenChain is going to change as more and more people consume open source as managed services? So obviously, the whole dynamic there is very different to how you have to, take the whole sort of open source supply chain effectively shifts to that service provider. So I'm interested in your thoughts as to OpenChain in the context of managed services.
Marcel, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to take it?
You can go ahead, Andrew. I'm still thinking.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a constantly moving target. I'm sure Shane has some sort of insights on this one as well. I mean, ultimately, the managed services, they have to be written by somebody. They will incorporate increasing amounts of open source code, but clearly the level of compliance that is necessary when you're operating on a SaaS basis, because most of the compliance triggers tend to revolve around distribution, are going to be very different. But I mean, we have clients. We have a client at the moment which is undergoing a conformance exercise. They use a huge amount of open source code. None of it ever leaves their organization, and none of it is even accessed on a SaaS basis by people outside the organization. So they're fully aware of the fact that from a compliance perspective, the chances of there being any form of external claim are extremely slim. But the reason that they're doing it is that, first of all, they need to know what they've got, and they want to institute a good set of practices and procedures, so that they can then start looking at other ways of delivering their services to clients. So it may be that they start to provide those services on a SaaS basis. It may be that they want to partner with other organizations that's going to require code flowing backwards and forwards between those organizations. But there's also a sort of feeling, and this is sort of driven by their head of IP, who is very focused on making sure that their patent portfolio is has got value and is sort of being appropriately used, etc. Is that there's a sort of big hole in the middle somewhere, and they don't really know what they've got, and they don't know what they're using. So in that case, it's not directly driven by the feeling that there's some immediate risk, but it's also driven because it's a good framework to enable you to know what you're actually doing internally, which will then enable you to pivot your business model in the future if you want to. So I think that's probably a sort of relevant dynamic as well.
Okay, thank you. That's good.
I think one thing that's interesting is that maybe for a company that doesn't distribute software, their processes regarding distribution can be very light, as in, no, don't do it.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, the OpenChain spec covers where they should have processes in place, including the no, don't do it. So I don't think OpenChain will change. It's just that those companies might be able to go light on some of the processes that
precisely.
have to go heavy.
Yeah, exactly.